Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm giving you another history lesson type video that's going to dispel some myths, modern myths, that weren't myths when I was a kid because it was well documented and we knew what was going on, but the times have changed and the internet has made people weird. So, this is the true story of why third-party companies abandoned Nintendo. But it's also going to be the true story of why third-party companies worked with Nintendo in the first place. So we got to give a little history lesson. In 1983, this Japanese company that nobody had heard of, called Nintendo Company Limited, was trying to get out of the arcade market and into the budding home video game console market. They had dabbled in the business with some Pong units, and they were doing the Game & Watch product line, and they decided they wanted to make a home console that was more advanced than this, that was comparable to what was on the market, the 2600 and the Intellivision. So they designed a machine that more or less used off-the-shelf hardware that was very similar to the CPU in the Atari 2600, but they gave it a co-processing unit. They called the picture processing unit, which made it have more advanced graphics than what was on the market at the time. And they introduced the machine as the Family Computer, or known as the Famicom in Japan. Now, over in 1983 in the US, the home video game market was going through what we refer to as a crash. The Great Crash of 1983, which was, again, I have to emphasize, isolated exclusively to the U.S., or North American, I should say, home console market. It didn't really affect computers or arcades at all. I'd say hardly at all, because a lot of the companies that were making arcade games were also making home video games, and their home console business was hit, but their arcade divisions kept going for a while, some of them. So at the time, basically all the software companies that were making video games for the Atari 2600. That was the IT product in the US and elsewhere. So these companies, they saw the writing on the wall. They were realizing that, the Atari games just weren't selling anymore. There was too much product, too much competition, too many bad games on the market, and so they were shifting their business practices. During this time, Atari and Nintendo were in negotiations first to bring the VCS to the Japanese market. That fell through, and then the negotiations shifted to maybe they could bring the Famicom to the US market under the Atari banner. Some backdoor shenanigans took place. Long story short, that deal fell apart, and as the economy in the U.S., the video game home console market was going through a course correction, Nintendo decided to swoop in and claim that market for themselves. There was no guarantee that they would be successful. They actually were a small company that had a very, very minimal presence in North America. Nintendo of America was a brand new division that had only opened a couple of years prior, and that was just so they could import Donkey Kong machines, more or less. They were starting to do some marketing outside of Donkey Kong, with like their television programs and serials and things, and their other arcade machines like Mario Brothers and Popeye, but they still hadn't become a household name yet. So Nintendo decided to work with the retailers. And they knew that the market had trepidations about the home console market because it had kind of collapsed. And nobody knew what the future was going to look like. Business people and journalists more or less wrote off the home video game market as a fad. Arcades and computers were the future. Now, Nintendo was already in the arcade business, so they had some leverage. They're like, hey, all our arcade hits are on this machine. That wasn't enough because those same arcade hits were on everybody's machines, and they weren't selling well. So they made a a legal agreement. They agreed to buy back any unsold machines. They also decided to, backdoor the NES into the US market by redesigning it as the Nintendo Entertainment System. The first redesign looked too similar to a home computer, so it was rejected by retailers. They're like, yeah, no, we still don't know what the home computer market's going to look like. Right now, all the buzz is around Commodore, and your machine doesn't do anything the Commodore does, so hard pass. So they redesigned it to look like a toy, and they created the robotic operating buddy and the zapper. The Rob, the robot, was a pack-in toy to trick retailers and families and kids. No, this is an interactive toy. It's not a video game. To continue the ruse, they called their cartridges game packs instead of cartridges or video game cartridges. They used the term game pack because they were like, well, we don't want it to sound like a video game. We want it to sound like a toy, but it has the word game right in the product title. So I'm going to chalk that up to, a half-ass attempt. But they were making an attempt to backdoor into the market. Now, Nintendo was not a very big company. And they were a Japanese company that in Japan, they had companies sign exclusive agreements. If you want to make games for us, you can't make games for anybody else. And the Japanese government said, eat shit. And so that didn't work. But because they tried it in Japan, they went ahead and tried it again in the US. And the US government was like, we don't give a fuck. What is a Nintendo? We don't care. Just as long as it doesn't explode or, give kids cancer, just leave us alone. Give us the money and leave us alone. And so they were able to get away with their very illegal monopolistic practices. So the way it worked is if you sign an agreement to make games for the Nintendo Entertainment System, you were signing on to a couple of hard details. Detail number 1, if you make a game for the NES, it cannot be on anything other than the NES. This game belongs to us. Not legally ours. It's not like you're making games for us. These are our games. We now own the IP. But we're the only one that can sell this game. And they put a lockout chip in the machine to prevent other people from writing software that would be compatible with the machine. Of course, hackers were able to break the lockout machine, and that triggered a lawsuit. Nintendo lost. There were other lawsuits involving Nintendo at this time. We're not going to get into all their lawsuits because they would be a very litigious company, and they would be very extremist in their litigation. They tried to sue Blockbuster for renting their video games. They lost that lawsuit. So yeah. The second caveat in their contract is you can only make a certain number of games a year. It was like 3 or 4 or something like that. It was a very small number because they were trying to prevent a repeat of the crash. The third caveat of the contract is Nintendo had final say in games that were given the seal of approval, that were given the license, which meant they had to play the game and they could A, approve it, yeah, sure, sell it, B, reject it with notes, yeah, if you censor this list of stuff, take it out of your game or change it to fit our game philosophy, yes, or C, just flat out reject it entirely, and then we'll get to what happened to the companies that got a C. Atari was one of them. And you also, not only did you have to have our seal of approval, you couldn't make the games for anybody else, and you could only make a certain number of games per year. You also had to buy the cartridges from us. Only we can manufacture the cartridges. You cannot manufacture your own cartridges because we have a patent on these cartridges, and so you have to buy your games from us. These are very, very, very restrictive policies that a lot of companies didn't want to abide by, but because when the NES launched, it was an instant, and I mean instant, overnight success. It just flew off shelves. People couldn't make it fast enough. There were shortages, and as is always the case with Nintendo products, but this was their first. Because they didn't know what the fuck they were doing. And so people were like, hey, we need more games. And companies were like, well, here's the thing. We can't make more games. But if we set up a shell company that we technically own as a subsidiary, but it's a separate company, Nintendo can't do anything about it. And then our shell company can make their 3 to 5 games a year, so we can double our output. And then Sega came along, and they had the Master System, and NEC Hudson Soft came along with the TurboGrafx 16, and they're like, hey, we want games on our system too, and we don't have enough resources to make all the games ourselves. We just can't. And so they went to third-party companies and said, would you make games for us? And companies that weren't making games with Nintendo said, yeah, sure, let's give it a shot. Other companies had to sign backdoor deals. They basically had to say, look, here's the deal. We'll program the game for your console. You have to license it from us and sell it yourself. Which means you got to manufacture the cartridges. You got to sell it in stores and put your name on it so we don't get in trouble with Nintendo. Not enough companies did this to circumvent Nintendo's monopoly, and not enough companies did this to give Sega or NEC a competitive edge, and so those products ended up more or less failing in the market, and the NES continued to dominate. Now, in the world of computers, Commodore was king, and so there were a lot of companies that were like, hey, those Nintendo games look fun, but we want them on our console, on our computer, but the third-party companies can't put those games on our computer, so we're just going to make our own clones, which again triggered lawsuits that Nintendo lost, because you can't you can't trademark or copyright gameplay mechanics. Because Nintendo tried to say, no, we own the patent on platformers. If you're making a platformer, you got to license it from us. And the Supreme Court said, fuck off. Get out of here, you dipshits. That's not how it works. And so they were just losing court cases left and right, but they were just like suing everybody. And third-party companies were like, well, we hate Nintendo. Like, hate Nintendo. But we have to do business with them because if we don't, we go out of business. Yes, Konami, SNK, Sega, Capcom, everybody, were still making lucrative arcade machines. They were still making big money in the arcade business, but that Nintendo market was much bigger than the arcade market. They needed those Nintendo dollars. They needed it. The video game market was finally legit alive and well. Let's go back to the companies that got a B grade. Some of the companies that got a B, the B option, you can sell your game, but you have to censor it. They went ahead and censored it. They're like, fuck it, we just want to get the game out. And they made their games. Nintendo had an anti-religious policy, which is not gonna fly in a heavily Christianized country like the United States. So you had companies that wanted to make Christian-themed video games, church games. They went to Nintendo and said, hey, we want to put this game on your console. And Nintendo said flat out no. No. There's nothing you can do to put this game on our console because it's a religious game. So these companies exercised option D. They decided to circumvent the lockout chip, manufacture the cartridge themselves, and release the games anyways. Which again, no surprise, triggered more lawsuits. This time, Nintendo's lawsuits kind of went in their favor, but also kind of didn't. So, they could enforce the policies, and they could put the lockout chip on their console, but if a company was able to reverse engineer the lockout chip and circumvent it through legitimate means, there's nothing Nintendo could do to keep them off the market. When they saw that the Bible Adventures companies were doing this, Atari, whose home console division was in shambles, and their arcade division was still doing okay, but not great, and their home computer division their lunch was getting eaten by Commodore, they said, alright, we need some of that Nintendo money too. Nintendo said no to our games. What do? Hey, this company found a workaround. Let's do what they do. And so they created a new company, a shell company called Tengen, and they started releasing unlicensed copies of Atari games under the Tengen brand. Now, at first, Nintendo, because they already lost their lawsuits, they decided to just ignore Tengen. They're like, fuck it, it's Atari, we don't care. They don't matter to us. But something happened that did change their mind. Atari, through a backdoor deal, got the license to manufacture an arcade machine using the Tetris property. Now, Nintendo figured out a workaround where they were able to license a exclusive rights from the Tetris rights holders that said, look, yeah, Atari's got the arcade machine, we want exclusive home console rights. Well, Atari, under the Tengen brand, brought their arcade Tetris to the market, and Nintendo first responded with a, look, Walmart, Target, Kmart, you guys want to play nice, here's the thing, we've got this game coming out called Super Mario Bros. 3. You know it's going to be a big hit. We don't want you selling Tengen games. So, if you're selling Tengen games, you cannot sell Super Mario Bros. 3. This pissed off the retailers. But, because they needed that Nintendo money, and they didn't need Atari money, they decided, alright, we'll play nice with Nintendo for now. Tengen got mad, tried to sue, but then found out they didn't have the rights to Tetris. Actually, Nintendo did. And Nintendo released their own version of Tetris, which is the one people remember. So now you have companies that are just begrudgingly working with Nintendo, but they're desperate for a way out. They got their way out in 1989. In 1988, Sega brought a new console to market in Japan, the Mega Drive, which they exported worldwide as the Mega Drive. But because of that they were capitalizing on the anti-Christian sentiment that Nintendo had with their no religious policy. They decided to rename their machine the Genesis, which is a blatant Christian biblical reference, in the hopes that it would sell well in the Bible Belt and trick Christians into thinking this is a Christian product, even though it wasn't. And they would sell their dirty devil Nintendo and buy the Christian Sega Genesis. This is an oversimplification of what happened, mind you, but it was part of Sega's strategy. It was not overt, it was not something they publicized, but it was something that was brought up in interviews in magazines. They're like, yeah, sure, it's a reference to the Bible, of course. Just kind of as because we want people to buy our product. It wasn't necessarily nefarious, but it was kind of a, look, our machine is called Genesis, and their machine is a Japanese word you can't even pronounce. Also, our machine is 16-bit, and we have a partnership with Michael Jackson, who at the time was the biggest pop star in the world, and his controversies hadn't begun yet, so they were starting to win the console war. People were shifting from the 8-bit Nintendo to the 16-bit Genesis Mega Drive. Now, this is where things get muddy, because Nintendo quickly replaces the NES with the Super Famicom in Japan and Super Nintendo Entertainment System worldwide. Now you have companies that are locked into exclusive contracts. They are required by law to make games for Nintendo and nobody else. But they're able to, some of them, renegotiate their contract like, look, we have to make games for a Nintendo console. You didn't specify which console we had to make games for. So they were able to migrate some of their games over to the Super NES to fulfill those contracts. Once those contracts were up, companies jumped ship. One by one, they left Nintendo for Sega. Even though the SNES was selling well and third-party companies were selling well, they were desperate to get off of ship Nintendo. They were like, no, we're going to Team Sega. Now, things get bloody. Sega does find success in North America with the Genesis, moderate success with the Mega Drive in Europe, and tremendous success in Brazil. But the Genesis is a dud. It's a non-starter in Japan. And it's a Japanese company run by very proud Japanese men who are like, look, our machine isn't selling. We have to get it off the market right now with something that will. And so Sega shoots themselves in the foot and scrambles and rushes to get the Sega Saturn on the market. I'm skipping over the Sega CD and the 32X. That's irrelevant to this part of the story because this is where Sega was fighting Sega of America, and Sega of Japan was like, no, we want to do this, and Sega of America was like, no, this machine is selling well, we want to do this, and Sega of Japan is like, no, but it's not selling in Japan, so fuck it. And Sega of America was like, all right, it's your lunch, and the president of Sega of America left the company and said, eat shit, you're on your own. That was Tom Kalinske, by the way. During all of this, there was the whole congressional hearings debacle, which led to the ESRB, where Nintendo was like, we would never sell a game with a gun on our system, even though a gun was a pack-in for our system, but whatever. And then, oops, the ratings came out, and all of a sudden, remember that restricted policy about censorship? We changed our mind. Now you can do whatever you want as long as your game has the appropriate rating. You submit it to the ESRB, we're good, but you still got to pay us royalties and buy the cartridges from us. Third-party companies were still making money on SNES, but they were getting tired of Nintendo's shit. New companies were coming on the scene. One company in particular, a European company, British, by the name of Rareware, who went through other iterations, ended up working closely with Nintendo during the SNES era and made a lot of money and formed a really good corporate relationship with Nintendo, really bulking up the Nintendo library, giving Nintendo gamers some kick-ass games that they could wave the flag and say, this is why our machine is better than yours, Sonic. And Nintendo was like, yeah. And Sega was like, but we have 6 Sonic games. And people were like, yeah, only 1 or 2 are good. The rest of them can, you know the rest of the story. So then Nintendo's like, well, Sega's in the 32-bit market now. Sony stabbed us in the back. We're not going to get into that story. And they're selling our machine under their name, but they redesigned it enough that we can't sue them for it, even though we tried. And now the PlayStation is on the market, and third-party companies are done with Nintendo. They're like, all right, we're going to go make games for Sony, because we tried to work with Sega, and that backfired and bit us in the ass. But we're actually doing well with Sony. And so third-party companies, once their contracts expired and they were no longer under obligation to make games for Nintendo, they left. And Nintendo came out with a new machine, the Nintendo 64, to no third-party support. All the third-party companies left. Konami, Acclaim, Capcom, Midway, SNK, Taito, fucking everybody left. And Nintendo was like, shit. We can only make 2 games a year for this thing because this is way beyond our capabilities. Yeah, we got the handheld division, which is doing fine, but we just lost our ass on the Virtual Boy. What are we going to do? Obviously, their first response is to turn to Rare, and Rare's like, we got your back, bro. Don't worry about it. But Rare's a small company. Nintendo's not writing blank checks, and they are a hard company to work with, quality control-wise. So Rare's like, all right, we'll double your output. So instead of 2 games a year, now you can have 4 games a year. And gamers are like, that's not good enough. I'll just go play PlayStation. And Nintendo's like, fuck. So they had to beg third-party companies to come back. They started with their best friend, Namco. And Namco was like, yeah, you, raped us in the ass for 6 years. What are you going to do? What are you going to offer us? And Nintendo had to make some deals with Namco. They had to make some deals with Konami and Capcom. Midway, who, was doing better on Sega and PlayStation anyways, decided, fuck it, we'll throw Nintendo a bone. Why not? We got nothing to lose, because they did work with Nintendo on a couple of projects, Cruis'n USA, Killer Instinct, so Midway's like, yeah, sure, we'll work with Nintendo, why not? They're not hurting us, because we didn't get bit by the NES bug, because we had 4 companies making games at the time. We could put our games wherever we wanted. So Midway was like, yeah, sure. So then other companies sprang up overnight. New companies who started out on the PC market were starting to bust into the Nintendo scene because they're like, look, we want to make games for the N64. It's a cool-ass machine. It's got horsepower that we can't get on PC right now, affordably. So yeah, let's do it. And one of these companies decided to work with Nintendo on a project that, in their words, was a nightmare. After all was said and done, that company left Nintendo, rebranded as Rockstar Games, and created this little game you may have heard of called Grand Theft Auto, which was an instant overnight mega hit and never looked back. And have to this day not even acknowledged Nintendo exists, other than one spin-off game that they licensed to them for the Nintendo DS once upon a time, just because they were like, yeah, sure, you know, we want money. You will make money this way. So by this point, the late 90s, you have third-party companies that are actively, vehemently angry at Nintendo. And Nintendo's like, alright, we're sorry. Here's some cupcakes. Pretty please make games for our N64. You still have to buy the cartridges from us. We can't make you sign exclusive contracts anymore because the courts said we can't do that. But if you do make exclusive games for us, we'll let you put our characters in your games. And the companies, some of them were like, not good enough. Others were like, whatever, we'll put Mario in our game. But the Dreamcast had already come on the scene, came and went. The PS2 was right around the corner. Nintendo knew the N64 was doomed basically from the start. Now, it wasn't a total flop, but they were not getting the output that they had expected. They were struggling. They needed to shift gears, so they changed their strategy with the GameCube. Their new strategy was, we're going to go cheap. We're going to make the machine inexpensive to make, and we're going to make it, you know, to where it's not as expensive to make games for it as it was previously. And third-party companies were like, okay, we'll play in your sandbox. But all across this time, from the NES till today, up to this point, Nintendo had been selling the most software on their machines. People were buying Nintendo consoles for Nintendo games. The market figured this out. Third-party companies figured this out. And Nintendo figured this out. And so third-party companies were like, if I put a game on your system and it doesn't sell because people would rather play Metroid or Zelda, what's in it for me? And again, Nintendo's first response was, well, you could put our characters in your games. This time, some companies were like, alright, sure. But Nintendo also had a couple other tricks they wanted to dangle in front of third-party companies to get them on board with the GameCube. Trick number one was connectivity. Look, you're already making games for the Game Boy because you make money on the Game Boy. We have this connectivity with GameCube. If you make a GameCube version of your game, you could incorporate connectivity with the Game Boy Advance version of your game, and gamers will buy both versions, and now you've sold 2 copies of the same game. Now, doesn't that sound nice? And third-party companies fell for it, gave it a shot, found out nobody bought the connectivity cable, and those games didn't sell, because that wasn't a hook, and the third-party companies were like, Jesus Christ, why did we fall for it again? And so once again, they started leaving Nintendo, and they started canceling games. Let's go back to Capcom. Capcom was one of the heavy hitters on the NES. They reduced their output significantly on the SNES. If you actually compare their output on SNES to NES, a significant drop in support. However, they all but abandoned the N64. No Street Fighter, 1 Mega Man game, barely any support on the N64. Nintendo knew that Nintendo gamers wanted Capcom games on their machine. They knew this. Konami was doing well enough that they kept making the games that they knew would target the Nintendo audience. They were fine with that, but Capcom was like, yeah, we're still kind of upset about what you did to us. So Nintendo had to negotiate a special deal with Capcom. The results of this negotiation and the actual terms have never officially been released, but the public result was the Capcom 5. Capcom promised they would make 5 dedicated exclusive games to the GameCube that would be big budget AAA titles that would get all their resources and all the marketing. As they were already developing their Resident Evil remakes and ports for the GameCube, porting the Dreamcast and PlayStation 1 games over and making, the remake of Resident Evil 1, etc., they started to realize, hey, Resident Evil sells well on this Nintendo machine for some reason. Who would have known? So they decided to make an exclusive Resident Evil game as one of the Capcom 5. But they put out another game first that was further along in development. Product number 3, P.N.03. The game bombed. Also, at this time, the Xbox came on the scene and was stealing some third-party companies, and PlayStation 2 was doing gangbusters. It would eventually become the best-selling game console of all time, tapping out at just about 160 million units, give or take, depending on who you use as a resource. There was no competition. It was PlayStation 2, Microsoft, and Nintendo were fighting for 5th place in a war that only had 3 places. So that's how disparaging it was between PlayStation and everybody else. But Nintendo was like, look, we've got to survive. We've got to work with third-party companies. And we got to do something. And the GameCube isn't doing it. Capcom, because product number 3 bombed, and they saw the writing on the wall, the remaining Capcom 5 games were either canceled or promptly ported to PlayStation 2 after they were completed. This would be Beautiful Joe and Resident Evil 4. The other 2 games have disappeared from the history books. We have no further information on them as far as I know, other than just rumors. Nothing concrete. And then Capcom walked away, and to this day have not really done hardly anything of note with Nintendo. They pretty much walked away. They said, we're done. Nintendo needed third-party companies to come back to them, so they came up with the Blue Ocean strategy, starting with the DS and then later the Wii. A lot of third-party companies were like, okay, we're not going to give you our games because this is inferior hardware. We want to focus our resources on these big open-world HD games people can explore, not your little kid's toy with your waggle wand. But we do want to make some of that sweet Nintendo money, so we will give you Wii bottle caps and Wii darts and we chase the cat around the yard, etc. Because, yeah, we want money, but we don't want to give you the real games. Some companies like Activision and Electronic Arts made half-assed ports of Wii games of their mainstream titles. Everybody else just dumped shovelware on the machine, and Nintendo was left to pick up the pieces with what was left of their catalog, and it was like, well, we have to do it ourselves. Now, we have to back up for a second, because remember when I talked about how amazing Rare games were on the SNES and the N64? Well, in another round of Nintendo being Nintendo, they failed to save Rare when they were in financial dire straits, and instead of investing in the company and buying them up and bringing their software exclusive to Nintendo, they let Microsoft buy Rare and lost their biggest partner. Like, just straight up lost the one company that was willing to work with them throughout it all. This fucked them up. Now, yes, Nintendo, as a company, has done well this whole time. But we're talking about third-party companies. Third-party companies have been like, well, every time we put a game on your system, nobody fucking buys it. Why would we keep putting games on your fucking system? And Nintendo keeps coming up with excuses. Well, if you cut out the features that are on the other consoles, like high-definition graphics and online game modes and, all the fun stuff people are paying money for, you could still sell your game on our system, but nobody's going to buy it because you had to cut out all the features. But hey, what do we care? Gamers were like, yeah, fuck that, and didn't buy those games. No surprise. But Nintendo was still making a lot of money on the DS and the Wii, and third-party companies had no choice but to put something on the machine, hence the shovelware, in the half-assed attempts at ports. But remember when I said the PS2 was phenomenally successful? The PS2 outlasted the Wii and outperformed the Wii. The PS2 was still selling gangbusters the entire time the Wii was doing well. In comparison to everything else Nintendo did up to that point, the Wii was a runaway hit. In comparison to PlayStation, on the other hand, it didn't even do PS1 numbers. To Sony, it was like, yeah, that's a day in the life of us. What of it? And Nintendo was like, oops, you're right. But we're still going to chug along anyways. Third-party companies were like, yeah, well, people aren't buying our shovelware because it is shovelware. And people aren't buying our half-ass ports because they're half-ass ports. So see ya, bye. And they left Nintendo again. So the latter years of the Wii were back to N64, bone dry, no more games but those that are made by Nintendo themselves. And a handful of companies like Sega and, Konami who were inexplicably making money somehow and everybody else was like, not. Then the Wii U happened. Repeat the story again. Same thing. Third-party companies were very hesitant to make games for it. They made half-ass ports. They didn't sell. Third-party companies blamed Nintendo or Nintendo fans and walked away. So let's talk about the Switch. You're going to say the Switch has good third-party support. Does it? Yes, compared to GameCube, compared to Wii U, compared to N64. But compared to PS4, 5, compared to Xbox, whatever it's called, compared to SNES and NES, no, it doesn't. Yes, the Switch has companies that have figured out how to make money and thrive in the Nintendo ecosystem. But the big heavy hitters who have walked away from Nintendo still haven't come back to the Switch by and large. You've got some, like, bone. They'll throw them a bone here and there. Yeah, we'll give you Skyrim. Yeah, we'll give you Mortal Kombat X, whatever. Or Mortal Kombat 11, whatever. You're still not getting Street Fighter, You're still not getting anything else Capcom is doing, although what else are they doing? Maybe a Resident Evil remake here or there. But, like, all those companies that left Nintendo have pretty much never come back, for the most part. Some of them are still doing the usual, well, we have to make money, your machine sells well, so we're going to put something on your system, but it's not going to be our A-list game, it's going to be like our C-list game, deal with it. And Nintendo fans are like, yay, look, third-party support. And everybody else is like, are you sure about that? And here we are. Same situation we've always been in. Nintendo is going to make games that will sell the system, and Nintendo gamers are going to flock to the Nintendo software, and everybody else is going to just either half-ass it or copycat what Nintendo's doing and do as best they can to try to, capitalize on some of that Nintendo money, because Nintendo gamers are desperate for anything to play. And yeah, there's a lot of shovelware on the Switch. Let's be real. There is also a lot of quality titles on the Switch. We're not disparaging Nintendo or the quality of their product. We're just giving you a history lesson of why third-party companies wouldn't make games for the Wii, even though it was the market leader, which it kind of was, but also kind of wasn't, because it was in its own market. It was the market leader of a market it invented, and the actual market was not Nintendo. The gamer market was Xbox 360 and PS3, who were duking it out for first place, or overall sales second place if you want to get technical. But to gamers and to the companies involved, first place doesn't mean shit. It doesn't matter if nobody's buying our games. I don't care how many hardware units you sell. If my game doesn't sell on your hardware is not worth my time. And that is the same thing happened to Sony with the PS Vita, by the way. So even they're not infallible. So I'm not just trying to sing Sony's praises all day long, although some people would accuse me of that. That's not accurate. Because I actually do love Nintendo. And I was with Nintendo all the way through the first 2 years of the Switch. I only sold my Switch because I had no choice. I lost my job. I was about to be homeless. I had to pay rent, so I sold all my video games. I didn't sell my Wii U. I would still have my Wii U. My Wii U was stolen by some asshole. That's what happened to that. I made the mistake of getting rid of my GameCube, and I've regretted it ever since. So, I'm not coming at it with Nintendo sucks, and that's why third-party companies won't make games with them. I'm telling you, Nintendo made some legitimately shitty business deals in the 80s and 90s that are having repercussions to this day. Now, some people would be like, well, they could get over it because they want to make money. Except, every time Nintendo gets the upper hand, they go right back to their old monopolistic ways as best they can within the framework of the law. They're just that kind of company. They are notoriously hard to work with. And it is notoriously hard to sell games that aren't made by Nintendo on a Nintendo console. It's just the way it is.